Hi, Cullen.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing great.
Well, I don't blame you for doing great. You wrote a great book we're going to talk about. Cartoon County, My Father and His Friends in the Golden Age of Make-Believe, which I'm holding up here. This is actually the bound galleys, not the hardcover, which is currently available at bookstores for people who might need a last-minute Christmas present to buy for someone. Let me say a little more about you. You've been with us before to talk about other books. You've written a book about the Inquisition. What's the name of that book?
God's Jury.
God's Jury. You wrote a book
I
called...
wrote a book about Rome.
Are We Rome? I forget the answer. I think you were a little equivocal.
Well, I had a question mark back when I wrote it, and I might take the question mark off now.
Yeah, I think if the question is, are we in a state of decline leading to chaos, I think it's easier to answer yes now than it was back then. But so I guess we could call you prescient for even raising
only
the question.
10 years.
Yeah. And you're an editor-at-large, I guess, at Vanity Fair is the title. You were managing editor of The Atlantic for many years. And this is all true?
It is, and I worked with you briefly at the Wilson Quarterly.
You did. I want to bring that up later in the conversation. What's that?
So we can't leave that out.
No, we can't. It becomes relevant later in the conversation. I want to dredge up a memory of mine from that when it becomes germane. But mainly, I want to talk about your book and congratulate you. I mean, I was so happy to open up my Sunday New York Times yesterday and see this cover review. Very favorable review from none other than Gary Trudeau, who knows a thing or two about comics. And I can see why it was a glowing review. Really, really is a good book. And, as we said, you've written some other books, including one we didn't mention called Rubbish, about rubbish. But I think more than any other book, this is the book you were born to write. Don't you think?
Well, I think it was time that I lightened up a little bit.
Well, no, but I mean, only you could have written this book. That is in some sense true of many, maybe all books. But this book, it's almost its own genre. It's kind of hard to... It is a memoir, kind of. That's what Gary Trudeau called it. But it's more than that. I mean, it's a story of a subculture, first of all of these cartoonists who lived in Fairfield County, Connecticut, as it happens. Who knew? During the golden age of kind of Sunday comics, the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And it's a story about a lot of them. It includes a lot of them. One of them was your father, who wrote, I guess, most famously the Prince Valiant, illustrated the Prince Valiant comic strip. And then you later came to be the person who wrote the text and did the plot line. You took over for Hal Foster, who had created it many decades ago. So it's a story about you and your father and your relationship and this subculture. And it's also kind of a story about that part of America's history in a certain sense. It's got a lot of dimensions, and it's got a lot of great pictures. I hesitate to show all this because I know that the actual hardcover, unlike the version I've got, is in color. And this doesn't do it justice to kind of flip through in a certain sense. But imagine all that in color, and there's all that. So, really interesting book. It's got some of the features of a coffee table book, but it's better than that because the story itself is worth reading. Even though you could set it in the coffee table, pick it up at random and be engaged by whatever you happened upon. So I think to set the stage for this, maybe especially for our younger viewers and listeners, we should try to convey what the magnitude of the Sunday comics in particular in like the 1960s, which I remember. That's when I became aware of them.
So, I mean, it's a good thing to do because, a lot of people nowadays just don't really have a great sense of how central the funny pages were in American life. This was a form that Americans pretty much pioneered back at the turn of the last century when you had the newspaper wars between Pulitzer and Hearst, and they were looking for a way to get advantage. And one of the ways that they came up with was comic strips. They had new kinds of printers, fast 4-color printers. They could produce this sort of thing in a way that they had never been able to before, and there were cartoonists who were just basically champing at the bit to get their stuff out there. So the funny pages were born in this newspaper war with mass circulation dailies, and they started off rapidly. It was an explosion, and it just continued up through the teens and the 20s with more and more strips all the time, including classic ones, a few that are still around, like the Cats and Jammer Kids. And the funny pages were beautifully produced. At their peak, they were kind of huge by today's standards. I mean, you had basically a newspaper broadsheet, which is bigger than a tabloid. And it's bigger than the New York Times is right now if you unfold it. And there'd be 16 of those broadsheet pages that could be published every Sunday. So you're looking at something like, 65 square feet of comics. So when I was a kid, say 1960 or so, you could have 16 pages arriving with Puck the Comics Weekly, and maybe 40 or 50 different features in there. And this was going basically to every household in America. It was even going more than that. There were more Sunday papers sold than there were households. And until you had competition from other forms of media, radio first, but radio wasn't visual. We all know that. And then photography began to make some inroads, but photographs and newspapers weren't all that great. And television was a big deal. That began to chip away rapidly at newspapers and at comic strips. And then the internet, of course. But for a long period of time in the middle of the American century, the funny pages were, very important as a social artifact.
And even when you talk about something like radio TV, we may need to remind younger people that you couldn't record this stuff. I mean, you had three, maybe 4 channels on TV, and you couldn't record it. So it was just whatever was on when you turned the TV on was the only option. You could bring in record albums and things, but you couldn't, there weren't that many ways for entertaining information to get into your house, and you couldn't magically summon it the way you can now. So when this thing arrived on Sunday, it got your attention. And the other thing is, of course, the newspapers were by and large in black and white. This is the one part that was in color, and it was only one day a week that you saw it. So it made an impact.
The newspapers were smart about how they marketed this. They knew that, in a typical household, the kids were up earlier than the parents. Mm-hmm. And the most attractive thing about the newspaper was the comics. So all the news sections they'd be wrapped inside the comic sections. So when you got it, and many people will even remember this. To some extent, it's even true now. When you get the Sunday newspaper, it comes wrapped in the comics because it was just more important. One of the big syndicates that distribute comic strips, Hearst or King Features, once did an experiment where they selectively began leaving parts of the newspaper out. They would send it out to 1,000 people and leave different parts out, and just to see who complained. And so you leave the editorial page out, nobody complains, and you leave the news section out. Okay, maybe 50 people complain out of 1,000. When they left the comics section out, they had 880 out of 1,000 people complaining. So that just gives you an idea of what people really cared about.
Yeah, and even I wasn't a big comics guy. I didn't read comic books. My parents were worried about me because I didn't look at the Saturday morning cartoons on TV. But even I remember, when you name these cartoons, I remember their basic identity. Blondie, Nancy, Snuffy Smith, Hi and Lois. You just couldn't miss them. And Prince Valiant. which you wound up writing, which was different from most of the other comics. There are only a couple of comics that weren't contemporary, and the only other ones I can think of were in the Stone Age, like BC, and that was more of a panel, not a series. But like Alley Oop wasn't that that was a Stone Age cartoon or something, right?
Yeah, that was Stone Age. BC was Stone Age, and Prince Valiant was Middle Ages. Mm-hmm. There were a few others. Most of them were contemporary, though.
Yeah. So I remember it very vividly, but I guess it never occurred to me to ask, where does this stuff come from? And I wouldn't have guessed that the answer is overwhelmingly from a single county in Connecticut, more than from any other one place. I mean, Fairfield County, it's within commuting distance of New York, but there's no income tax, a lot of appealing features. It's now known as some place that Wall Street types buy mansions, but it wasn't back then. And so you grew up there amid all of these really important and influential cartoonists whom your father hung out with. Right now, originally he was writing this strip called Big Ben Bolt, which was about a prize fighter and then a former prize fighter, I guess, as he aged. But that ended in that was in the 50s and 60s, and then I guess he took over Prince Valiant in 1970 or so, and then you started writing it about a decade later. But you were part of this, and when I knew you in Washington during the 7 months when we overlapped at the Wilson Quarterly, I didn't think of you as somebody who had this kind of upbringing, in a certain sense privileged, not in a financial sense, but I didn't think of you as among the hated cultural elite. But apparently you were.
When you're in the comic strip business, you're in the beloved cultural elite.
Okay.
not the hated one. At the time, it didn't seem all that strange growing up, because it's never going to seem strange to a kid. Whatever the circumstances are, it seems like this is normal life. As you begin to get older, it becomes you get more awareness of the fact that. Oh, hey, I'm living a bit of an outlier culture here. And the thing that for myself, my brothers and sisters, and other children of cartoonists, the thing that most set you apart initially was the fact that your dad worked at home. Mm-hmm. And that was actually a pretty significant difference from other families. This was the heyday of the man in the gray flannel suit, and you were accustomed to, the father, and it almost always was the father, getting on a train in the morning, wearing a gray flannel suit or a black one or a dark blue one, and carrying a briefcase and coming home, at 7 or 8 o'clock at night. That was their life, and and I eventually figured out that was. That's what most white collar people did in Fairfield County, but it wasn't like that. We came home from school, and my father was there in the studio, and you could go out and you could talk to him, and he was just a presence all the time. Now, the studio itself, you began to realize was something pretty out of the ordinary. I mean, it was a really magical place. There was a big drawing board. There were these wonderful smells of ink. And paint remover, and there were costumes because my dad took a lot of pictures of himself.
Oh, and you took the pictures sometimes, right?
More than sometimes. It was several times.
So he would take pictures of himself. I mean, I'm going to show an example that our audio podcast listeners, alas, will not be able to see. But he would take pictures of himself that would then he would use to illustrate. Some part of Prince Valiant in various poses, right? In costume with a certain expression and so on. Turns out other cartoonists did this. I learned from reading your book. I had no idea.
Anyone who was doing a story strip, as opposed to the funny so-called Bigfoot strips, was probably doing something like this. Mm-hmm. Stan Drake, who did The Heart of Juliet Jones, did this. Alex Raymond, who did Rip Kirby and Secret Agent X9 did this. But even before them, Norman Rockwell did this all the time when he was composing.
Speaking of Norman Rockwell, I just want to show a picture. Your father had, in a certain kind of privilege, I guess. He grew up kind of next door to Norman Rockwell in New Rochelle, right? And here's a picture I'm showing again. That is your father. Your father posed for that Saturday Evening Post cover by Norman Rockwell. But go on.
The same street in New Rochelle. Before Rockwell went up to Vermont and then to Massachusetts, he lived in New Rochelle, as a lot of illustrators did, and cartoonists too. And so my father was a model for Rockwell, and he was trained by Rockwell. And Rockwell got him a scholarship to the Art Students League. It was a very important relationship,
I would think.
And for those who have a kind of a warm feeling in their hearts towards Norman Rockwell, as I do, I should note that the dog who was nestled so nicely against my father's leg had to be drugged in order to.
And Rockwell was not above drugging a dog for a good picture.
I know. Some people resort to Buddhism, some resort to drugs.
Yeah, well, whatever works. Speaking of dogs, and speaking of the sense in which you had a privileged upbringing, I mean, I'm going to show one more picture. I'll describe it for podcast listeners. Did it not occur to you at this point that you were leading a privileged life, Cullen? This is you and Rin Tin Tin, this is the actual Rin Tin Tin, right? This is when you're what? What are you, 5 years old or something?
I'm probably 5 years old. And, well, is it the Rin Tin Tin, or is it like number 2 and number 3? I think it's probably the first one. It was... Cartoonists were able to get a lot of people to come to their gatherings. It's an indication of the place they held in pop culture. If you had an event and you knew that 100 cartoonists were going to be there, lots of people wanted to go to that event. All the big sports figures, the heavyweight fighters, all the baseball people, and the football people, and the politicians. And it turns out the dogs. And so it was at a cartoonist event that Rin Tin Tin showed up.
And you met these various other people. They came over to the house, or your father. What are the big names? Reel off the names of some of the cartoons that emanated from Fairfield County. I think maybe all the ones I mentioned, am I right, did Beetle Bailey?
Probably, my rough calculation got to be over 100 when it came to the number of cartoonists. And I won't waste your time with every name, but, Little Orphan Annie and Nancy and Henry and Beetle Bailey and High and Lois and Hagar the Horrible and Amy and the Heart of Juliet Jones and Rip Kirby. It just goes on and on. And the people who did these strips were fairly close knit. They socialized together a lot. So if my parents had a dinner party or a cocktail party, and this was peak cocktail party time, 3/4 of the people there would be cartoonists, and it would be the same if they went to other people's houses. So it was kind of a bohemian subculture within the larger Fairfield County culture, and so, over the course of growing up, I knew most of these people and knew many of them very well. The ones who were my father's closest friends, were over at the house constantly.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned the word bohemian. That's when I first looked at this book and got a real sense for the milieu of your upbringing. The first thing I thought was I hadn't pegged him. Cullen is coming from a bohemian background. Not that your description of it really screams bohemian, but just as soon as I imagined a bunch of artists of any kind living together, I figured, a bunch of probably flaming lefties who are, experimenting with whatever, wild sex and drugs. Now, as it happens, what you say, and it's an interesting question because these people were exerting probably some kind of influence on American culture. But what you say in the book is that they were politically liberal, but culturally conservative.
I think they were deeply conservative temperamentally. They were people who, I don't have a precise figure, but 3/4 of them had been in World War II in one capacity or another. They were 21, 22 years old when they went off to the war. They were proud of the fact that they had fought. So they came back to this country, and by and large, they liked what they had seen. Mainly they had been over in places that did not hold up very well by comparison with the United States. Even acknowledging the deep flaws that the country has. They got in at the beginning of the great post-war boom. They were living, this group anyway, was living in suburbia, which was also characteristic of the mid-American century. They were they were mainly monogamous, and they were in Fairfield County partly because they wanted to raise families in a decent way. So they were more or less patriotic. They liked America, essentially. So yes, I think most of them probably were liberal, but the deeper current is something that was was basically very, very American in a simple sense. I don't mean simple-minded, but I just mean you would have taken them by surprise if you had tried to question them pointedly and aggressively about their most fundamental feelings about the country.
Mm-hmm. And your father was very religious.
He was. I had the great opportunity to read his diaries and his letters from World War II, and he's going to Mass all the time and going to confession all the time, which maybe is a natural reaction if you're in a war zone.
But it's like more than once a week, right? He's going to Mass.
Yes, and but after the war, throughout his life, he was a deeply religious man, and again, there was just something about it that was woven into his persona, his psyche, his thinking. It was not overly ritualistic. It was not overly theological. It was just part of his being.
Mm-hmm. Now, your childhood sounds pretty idyllic. I mean, your memories of it seem to be that way. It just sounds like a great, it makes you want to have been you growing up. I mean, it sounds great. Now, Gary Trudeau in his review said something. I mean, first of all, he conveys that for him, it's a kind of intense life being a cartoonist, meeting the deadlines, a lot of you get the sense angst and turmoil. And he alludes to your telling, in your telling, he concedes there isn't so much of that. And I wonder if that has to do with just the kind of person your father was. It sounds like you talk about your father and your mother, and it sounds like your father was just a pretty easygoing guy. Is that right?
He definitely was. And but what Gary Trudeau was putting his finger on is something I certainly recognize. All of these people were living with deadlines, and they were very hard deadlines. It was not like, your and my deadlines where we talk to a publisher. Never mind, let's not go there.
Well, we've had real deadlines in our lives, but book deadlines are not among them. Yeah.
Well, we do have real deadlines. But for the cartoonists, you've got a certain amount of material. It has to be done at a certain time. I mean, this stuff is appearing daily, after all, and it's got to go into the maw of a big system of syndication. So, and you're just a little cog. So you have to have the stuff there on time. So my father was living with deadlines, but those of us who were kids were not living with his deadlines. That was his problem, in a sense. Every time we went out to the studio, it always felt like, oh, he's got time for me. He's got time to show me how to draw a horse or a hand. And I know from his point of view, it probably looked a little bit different. It looked like, oh dear, the first one is home from school and I've got 7 more.
Right.
And so it was constant. And there were times when he would get behind. And sometimes I had to go into New York City and bring the strips in physically to the syndicate.
Right. Well, part of the beauty of living in Fairfield County is if you failed to get the thing in the mail in time, there was the stopgap measure of getting on the train the next day, right? That's right. And you would not be surprised if you found another cartoonist on the train doing the same thing. When I was 10 years old, I don't think I tell the story in the book, but when I was 10 years old, my father had missed a deadline. He had to get the strip to New York, and he didn't have time to go in himself because he had to work on the next one. So he put me on the train. He had the strip all wrapped up. He had a string tied around the strip, and the string was tied to my belt. And he sent me into New York to Grand Central Station, where a man was there to meet me coming off the train, get the strip, put me back on the right train back to Coscow. You actually mention that in the book. You don't tell the story in such detail. So he didn't trust you enough to not tie the thing to you? Is that he didn't think you had the minimal competence to just hang on to it?
I don't know what he felt, but the truth is that I did at a much older age leave a painting of his on a train.
Ooh.
And it was never recovered. So I think he was wise.
He was wise beyond his years. That's good. So, part of the it's funny. I mean, the world you convey is an idyllic world. That was your experience as a child. It was a part of American history that I think a lot of people look back on kind of fondly, kind of pre-Vietnam, before things started getting more complicated in some way. Of course, there are a lot of Americans who don't, and they weren't getting a great deal. But people in my demographic and yours, for them, it was a period of relative calm. And that kind of came through that was certainly the idea conveyed by the comics, right? I mean, to read the comics, the Sunday comics, you would never have thought there were any actual significant problems in the world. Now, how much of that, I guess, emanated from the nature of the cartoonists, and how much of that was the market that they were, the demand they were meeting, and then how much of it was kind of actual censorship, just the elites, the people who ran the big syndicate or whatever, laying down guidelines?
That's a great question. I think a lot of it is in the middle ground there in terms of the market is where the answer lies. There is some censorship, and I'll come back to that. And in terms of the opinions of individual cartoonists, I think a lot more of the cartoonists would have pressed further than they did if they could have. Not all of them. Some of them were just doing strips that had they just weren't living in the modern world anyway. But the market with a mass medium like Sunday newspapers, there are going to be constraints that are built in that you don't have, for instance, with cable TV, or you don't have with graphic novels, where the material can find its own niche and the creator doesn't have to worry about 150 million people's opinion. But newspapers don't have that luxury, and so how far out ahead of a certain denominator, I won't call it the lowest common denominator, but how far ahead of a certain denominator you can go is always going to be a source of tension. But it's going to be less than you can do if you're writing for a niche audience, or writing a book, for instance. So that's going to be a drag in terms of your social activism. It just is.
Mm-hmm.
And people like Charles Schulz and Mort Walker had to fight for years to get African American characters
Is that right?
Yeah, into their strips.
Now,
which
did Mort Walker do Beetle Bailey?
Yes.
That was an army kind of strip for people.
That's right. And it was I think it was around 1970 or 69 when he finally got an African American character. Well, I mean, the armed services were significantly African American by that time.
Absolutely.
And the comic strips had lagged behind. Charles Schulz, just to indicate the nature of the problem that you get from a mass medium, he fought and eventually succeeded in getting an African American character as one of the school children, and got a letter from a reader saying, I don't mind having an African American child in the strip, but does he have to go to the same school?
And that's what the people at the syndicate knew would happen. I mean, they had, and that's why they had resisted.
That's right. But in a broader sense, I mean, your other point is that the strips at this point are reflecting, they're reflecting a kind of suburban America, because that's the water these fish are swimming in. Just as at the turn of the last century, a lot of the strips were urban, they were grittier, they featured immigrants, and perhaps not always in the way that we would find acceptable right now. But the world that the strips were reflecting was an ambient reality that was different from the one that was in the 50s and 60s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now you said a lot of these people were in World War II. Your father wound up, and I guess a lot of these cartoonists, their artistic talents were utilized when they were in the military. Your father wound up on Douglas MacArthur's staff and did portraits of the whole of pretty much all the high-ranking people. He did a number of Douglas MacArthur, right, and of Douglas MacArthur's wife.
Yeah, he was being used by the general staff as a way of currying favor. I mean, how many generals, I guess not since the Renaissance, have had artists on their staffs, and when you have one, it's a wonderful way to be able to lubricate relationships with other people. So my father would be dispatched to do a portrait of this person or that person, and it was just a way of increasing the bureaucratic amiability of the people you had to work with. And he did do MacArthur, I think 4 or 5 times, and he did Mrs. MacArthur, and he did MacArthur's son, and many other people. But he also had time to do real war scenes. What was it like for ordinary people during the war, men and women? And what was it like for the people who were the civilians who were living in these areas? People in New Guinea, people in Japan or the Philippines. And he experimented with many, many different styles during this period. And it was I think it was a real creative awakening for him.
Mm-hmm. Now, I guess so a number of them had come out of World War II. The main strip I think of that obviously grew out of the experience is Beetle Bailey, right? Were there other famous military strips? I'm trying to think. That's all I recall. Wait, yeah, that is all I.
There were a few, but not too many. The public didn't really want to carry the experience of the war forward into civilian life, mm-hmm. and I think a number of the strips reflected that fact. That some of the strips had begun as military strips in military papers, and when they returned stateside, they became civilian strips.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the characters who then had entered civilian life, just like everybody was doing. The Beetle Bailey actually began life not as a military strip, but as a strip about a college student, and after a short period of time, made the transition to a military strip. So it went the other direction.
I remember it. My father was in the Army. That was always the context when I was watching cartoons, reading comics, and maybe that's why I remember that part of it. Now, Mort Walker, who did that, you said, and you mentioned this in the Terry Gross interview, and if people don't get enough of you here, they should download the Fresh Air episode that you were in. But she talked about the kind of censorship. I don't know to the extent to which it was actually written out, but you couldn't, for example, have belly buttons. And Mort Walker made a sport of testing that limit and drawing in belly buttons. But then by the time they showed up in the paper, the belly button would be gone.
Yes, so there are many things you couldn't show, and you figure you do have to wonder, why are they drawing the line here? But belly buttons was one. Mort would just promiscuously put in belly buttons after a while just to get their goat. He'd put in a crate of navel oranges and things like that. But nipples, why couldn't you show male nipples? But that was one of the rules. Now you probably know why men have nipples, which is another whole question. But in any case, you couldn't. And so you spoke earlier about strips like, Alley Oop and BC, and then my father did a prize fighting strip. These were all strips where you showed a lot of bare-chested men, and there's something missing.
Yeah.
And
I guess the idea was that if you showed young boys men's nipples, they might start thinking of women's nipples or something, and then it would be the slippery slope to hell.
The slippery slope argument.
But it's funny, just to show you what a conservative era it was. And my parents were unusually conservative, West Texas farm families. They had both come from. But I remember asking my father when I was, 7 or something. I said, "Dad, what are belly buttons for?" Now you would think he could just level with me.
Well, but that gets you into some very fraught terrain.
Exactly.
Quickly,
so you know what he told me? He said it marks your middle. That's what a belly button is for, to mark your middle.
Well, he's not wrong.
Well, we don't know.
It also marks your middle.
But anyway, so your father couldn't draw male nipples on Big Ben Bolt, and that was, but still, he drew Big Ben Bolt for like 2 decades. So that was his first big Sunday comic gig. That strip, right? He got that in 1950. He kept doing it until 1970, right? And that was like that was in the standard Sunday supplement.
That's right. It was a 5-day-a-week strip, and then there was a Sunday version of it, and which was different from Prince Valiant, which was only Sundays.
Right.
And but Prince Valiant was so much more complex when it comes to illustration. But you would find that many cartoonists were on this 5-day-a-week schedule for the dailies and then the Sunday. And the Sunday would often be a different storyline from the dailies if you were doing an adventure strip. So you have this 2-track system in place.
So he was doing Big Ben Bolt daily as well as he was drawing it daily as well as, or did I misunderstand?
And Sunday.
And Sunday. That's a lot of work.
It is a lot of work.
But as you said, Prince Valiant was almost more like doing a painting. I mean, it was really elaborately illustrated, very finely textured. So even though that was only once a week, I'm sure that was a lot of work.
I mean, he's working on a piece of paper. Well, can you see one in the background of this?
And I can. There is one on your wall, and I'll be looking for a Valiant strip to show to put up on the camera, because there's a number of illustrations of them. They're probably in color in the actual book. What I'll be showing you is black and white. But go ahead and talk, and I'll show them.
While I've got to plug in my power.
Okay. Meanwhile, I'm showing them this. That's an example of a single panel from a Prince Valiant strip. So it's pretty elaborate. Your father, and it's a crowd shot, and your father, there's a moment in the book where you say, your father was doing all the different poses that he would then use to draw off of, and somebody, I guess, pointed out that all the Goths looked like him, and he said, well, they would have all been related anyway. So
he shows up everywhere. Yeah.
So, but it's very richly illustrated. So then at some point so he took it over because Hal Foster, who had created it long ago, was getting arthritis, couldn't do the drawing up to his own standards anymore. So your father takes it over in 1970. And then tell us how you wound up taking over the writing part and the plotting.
So my dad takes it over right around the time when, I'm going off to college. And like many people, I don't really know what I'm going to be doing with my life. But I have a vague idea that maybe being a writer of some sort is what is in the cards. And so at some point, after my father takes over the strip, I entertain the idea, well, maybe I could come up with some plots that Hal Foster could use, which I did. I would, I'd write them out, maybe 2,000 words.
And this started when you were how old?
Oh, 20.
Mm-hmm.
And it was exactly 20.
And you were majoring in medieval history at Amherst at about this time.
That's right. That was a fluke. I mean, it had nothing.
Well, was it a fluke? Do you think you would have done it if your father hadn't been writing Prince Valiant for?
Yeah, yes, I probably would have been.
Okay.
But the attractions of medieval history are
well more evident to some of us than others. But I'll go ahead.
Anyway. So I sent those narratives off to Hal Foster, and he liked them, and he used them. He took them, made his own changes, turned them into comic strip style, and but it at least showed me that I knew how to come up with the right sort of plots. It's another story, though, doing it in real comic strip fashion. Breaking it into panels, getting the right number of words, getting the right relationship between the words and the picture, what is the function of each of those things? And that was harder. And the first time I tried it, Hal told me in no uncertain terms that I had not been successful. But then he explained to me, well, here's what you need to do in order to make this work. And it was a very concise mini tutorial on the nature of comic art. Mm-hmm. And I was forever grateful for that. Without that, it was like someone throwing a glass of cold water in your face and then shaking you by the shoulders and saying, come on, wake up, do it this way. And it worked.
Yeah, and you go into it in the book, and it really is a stiff challenge to do one of those things. I mean, as he says, there's a continuing story week to week. You've got to be able to remember it from last week. On the other hand, if you want somebody who just shows up new to see the first panel and get engrossed and be able to roughly figure out what's going on, you've got to advance the plot in a small number of panels. It really is quite, there's a lot of work being done. And one question that occurred to me as I was reading the book, I was reading your book and I was marveling at the writing. It's really beautiful writing as always. And I was thinking, there's not a sentence in the book that seems careless, that seems... every sentence is written with care. And I wondered if you think that, writing that comic strip had influenced your writing. You really don't. I mean, every word has to be chosen with care, just about right, if you've got that little space to do all of what you're doing.
That's a good point, and thank you for what you said. I think one of the great lessons of working on a comic strip is economy. How much can you say with the fewest number of words? And until you're faced with the truly tight constraints of a panel can only have 63 words in it, and you've got to achieve certain things in that panel. And until you're faced with that and you realize you've written 103 words and you've got to get it down, well, how do you do it? And the kind of thinking that you have to put into it and figure out, how can I get this point across, and yet get rid of that, sentence number 3, is a real challenge. And I think anybody's writing would be helped if they were simply told, all right, you've written something and it's good, now cut it by half and say the same thing, just as a classroom exercise. It's, often you can do it. There's a point after which you can't do it, but you can cut an awful lot out, and it's very instructive to see how much can be cut out.
Mm-hmm. And this brings us to the thing I had promised to bring up about when I worked with you in Washington at the Wilson Quarterly in the early 80s, not long after you'd taken over the strip. Now, there is one thing about the strip is that it's written in a kind of language that seems archaic, like it could be from the Middle Ages, and yet it has to be intelligible to a modern reader, which means it can't be the way they actually spoke in the Middle Ages. But what I remember is, I showed up at that job at the Wilson Quarterly, and somebody told me that you wrote the Prince Valiant strip. Now, like I said, I had never been a big comic strip reader, but I was getting the Washington Post. It was there, so I started reading it, and I remember one line in particular which illustrates this. There was some character, I don't know if it was Val or who wanted to make it look like he had been in a fight. He was going to tell some story about how he had been ambushed or something. I don't know. So he took thorns and kind of scratched up his own skin so he could say he'd been in a fight. And I remember the line. It was, I think, word for word. It was, he scored his flesh with thorns. And I remember thinking, now nobody would actually use the word score that way these days, and yet everyone knows what it means. And that's the kind of thing you had to do, right? I mean, that is that kind of like faux archaic kind of language, right?
That's right. And fortunately, I mean, English is such a rich language. There is that middle ground of words that are not so archaic that you don't understand them, but slightly more archaic than the ones you use, like sear, S-E-R-E, instead of dry. So that's a good one. That gets you into a little bit of Sir Walter Scottish territory. I think one of the things that helped in this regard was my father had a great ear for words, and he loved language, and he also loved novels that had been written in the 19th century, which are just filled with that kind of language. One of the great things about modern culture is that if you talk in 19th century language, it sounds to the modern ear like the 15th century. And so he had a great vocabulary, and he would often use the second most popular term for something rather than the one that everyone was using. And you could almost see him savoring the fact that aren't you surprised I used that word?
Calling someone hirsute or something?
Yeah, that kind of thing.
So I know you said you've got to get in a car right about now and go somewhere, so I'll let you go. But the last thing I want to do is read the epigraph of the book and then have you tell me why you chose it. It's from, now should I know who this person is? Is this embarrassing that I don't know who G.M. Trevelyan is? Is that embarrassing?
You mean apart from being a authoritative sounding Brit?
Yeah.
Who wrote epigraphs for books?
That's who I thought he was. Well, let me read what he wrote. He wrote, "The poetry of history lies in the quasi-miraculous fact that once on this earth, once on this familiar spot of ground, walked other men and women as actual as we are today, thinking their own thoughts, swayed by their own passions, but now all gone, one generation vanishing into another, gone as utterly as we ourselves shall shortly be gone, like ghosts at cockcrow."
Yeah, another happy thought, eh?
Well, it's a pretty happy book, actually, but
in a way, it's the happiness that prompts the choice of that epigraph. The world I'm writing about is gone. Almost everyone who was active in it as an adult is gone. Their work is lying in drawers in archives. So it's not a living thing anymore, and yet it was a living thing. And I remember it as a living thing. And that experience, even though it's gone now, it's not gone in my mind, but at some point that will be gone too. So that quotation just summed up in many ways my own marvel and sadness about, the joy and creativity that these people gave us, and also the fact that that task is now passed into the hands of another generation who will have to pass it on in turn.
Mm-hmm. Well, you draw that out really well. I mean, it does. The book does transport you to a different place in time, and it's evocative in the true sense of the word, and teaches you all this stuff that you never would have dreamed about this very important epicenter of a certain part of American culture. So it's Cartoon County, My Father and His Friends in the Golden Age of Make-Believe. And really, I have to say, it's really well positioned for purchase for a Christmas present. And there are several shopping days left. I'm sure that hadn't occurred to you, had it, Cullen? That
No, it hadn't. But now that you bring it up, I'll second your.
Okay, I'm glad to hear that I've got your approval on that one. Well, thanks so much, Cullen, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Bob.